Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome from the city of Norwalk, Ohio, the Maple City, as it's called sometimes. We're out here in what we consider to be a pretty good part of the United States. And I'm going to maybe uh, make you a little better informed on the connections between Norwalk, Ohio and Norwalk, Connecticut, of which there are many. We go back, I always start Norwalk's history with the year 1662, when King Charles II granted the charter to the colony of Connecticut. No one in England or no one in the eastern United States knew how wide the United States was. Some considered it to just be an island in the ocean. And so the charter called for Connecticut colony to run from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, from sea to sea, and north of Long Island Sound and north of the 41st parallel of latitude. And that was fine at that time. Nobody knew what it was like out here in the Western country anyway, or how far away the Pacific Ocean was. Well, not much settlement took place in this area west of the Allegheny Mountains until after the Revolutionary War. There were 5 states who had claims to the same land here in what we call the Midwest. Some people consider us still to be in the East. The Connecticut claim, of course, crossed New York State, crossed the Pennsylvania, and went on to the Pacific. Maryland had a claim, Virginia had a claim, and some of these states said they would not join the new Union of the United States after the Revolutionary War until the Western claims were settled. So they got together and they decided who would take what land, who would keep what land, and who would give up what land. And everybody did that. Everybody kept something and gave up something. Connecticut kept what they called their Western Reserve, and that was a tract of land north of the 41st parallel, and it extended west 120 miles along Lake Erie to a point to what is now the west line of Huron County in Erie County, Ohio. And that was to be their Western Reserve. They gave up everything else. Virginia kept a tract down in central Ohio that was the Virginia military tract. If anybody does genealogy or research on Virginia history, they run into the Virginia military tract. And all of them, as I say, kept some land, gave up some land. Well, this 120 miles west of Lake Erie is now what is Northeast Ohio, Cleveland, Elyria, a little bit of Akron, and so on. All those cities are in the Western Reserve. And it extended far enough west. Of course, it included our area where we are. The majority of this land was sold through the Connecticut Land Company, and the money was invested for the benefit of public education in the state of Connecticut. The fund still, at the time in 1800 or whatever, that sale of the Western Reserve generated about $1 million, and that fund still exists. It has paid interest for years into the Connecticut School Fund, and has helped public education in that state. Actually, Connecticut had a generation after the Revolutionary War, especially in these towns that I'm going to talk about that were such as Norwalk, Connecticut. There were no schools because the schools had been burned, destroyed, and the school supplies. So there was a generation of Connecticut who I won't say the people were illiterate, but there were no public schools, and not many records were kept carefully because there was no material on hand. Well, going back a few years to the American Revolution, the British Army was in control of New York City, and not very far away was the state of Connecticut, or the colony of Connecticut. And there were no really major battles ever fought in Connecticut during the Revolution, but the people were very busy. Many of them were small home manufacturers. They made combs and soap and what have you, furniture and buckets and barrels and what have you, for the market. They were small industries, and they shipped the supplies that they were making to the Continental Army, to General Washington's army, by way of the Long Island Sound. Well, the British were patrolling it, and they would occasionally capture a ship, but they decided if they sent an expeditionary force into Connecticut and destroyed the shops and the warehouses and the wharves and the shipping, they would stop the Continental Army from being supplied. Well, there were raids at different times that this happened on 9 different towns. The purpose, as I said, was to destroy the manufacturing and shipping, but things got out of hand. For one thing, the fires spread more than what they intended, and much private property, homes, barns, the churches, schools, things like that were destroyed also. The towns that were burned, were raided, were Norwalk, New Haven, East Haven, Fairfield, Groton, or Groton as we call it in Ohio, Danbury, New London, Ridgefield, and Greenwich. And Greenwich we call Greenwich here in Ohio. So those were the towns at different times were badly damaged. When Norwalk, Connecticut was invaded in July of 1779, 80 of the 86 houses in that town were destroyed, along with barns, stores, warehouses, and the public buildings. After the war, these victims, most of them, had rebuilt their homes and their businesses as best they could, and they went to the state legislature for some sort of compensation. Well, you know how state legislatures are. They never have any money. So they said, well, we'll give you some land out there in Ohio. We have that Western Reserve that's just waiting for you people to come out and live in it. Well, by 1792, which is 10 years after the war ended, all the claims had been submitted and audited, and the Connecticut legislature set up a group called the Fire Sufferers Committee, and they were to take care of the affairs of what they called the sufferers, fire sufferers land, or later called the Firelands. Now we make it one word, and we give it kind of a different sound. We call it the Firelands. If you're from around here, you hear people say that. Anyway, the legislature set aside this 500,000 acres, and that was to be for the fire sufferers to have. Well, it was out at the western end of the Western Reserve, and that's about as far as the United States extended. You couldn't go much farther into the wilderness than you could to come out here to the Firelands. And although they say that really never have victims of war been awarded damages in this way, of especially of being given land, and even given anything. Typically, it usually was if your property got destroyed in the war, well, that's the way it is. That's war is war, and that's that. But they did give them this land, and but that's all took place in 1792. Well, it was another 13 years until they made a treaty with the Indians, the American Indians, for the land, and in 1805, so that the Western Reserve west of the Black River, west of the Cuyahoga River, west of Cleveland, from there out here to the Firelands, all of this land was purchased by treaty from the Indians, and the people, but then they had to survey it. Well, the federal surveyor, the government surveyor, he ran the baseline on the 41st parallel. He went too far west, drove a stake and said, here's 120 miles. The fire sufferers hired a surveyor to come out and survey it. He got all done, got back to Connecticut, and they said, guess what? That guy drove the stake in the wrong place. He was too far out. So the federal government had to resurvey, reestablish the 120-mile point, and then the surveyor had to come back and do his work all over again. Survey this out into 5-mile square townships, and so he didn't survey into 100-acre farms or anything like that, but he had to survey them and in the township lines so that everybody knew what township was what. Well, by the time he got done, late in the year of 1808, 25 years had gone by, and most of the original sufferers had died. Some of them had left their claims to their children. Some had let them be sold because the state of Connecticut wasn't any fool. You had a claim out here, you couldn't come out and live on it. You didn't even know what it looked like. Was it trees? Was it rocks? Was it a swamp? Whatever. But you had to pay tax on it. Every town taxed the people on the value of their claim. So many of these sufferers, actual sufferers, sold out their claim cheap. They sold it to a land speculator. Other claims were foreclosed on and sold for non-payment of taxes, so that actually the people who came here to settle did not get in a covered wagon with the ruins of their house burning behind them and come to Ohio. That didn't happen. There was a 25-year lapse, and I think only perhaps 2 or 3 of the actual sufferers ever came to Ohio, ever saw their claim. One of them was Taylor Sherman from Norwalk, Connecticut. He was on the sufferers committee, but he had a claim out here, had a township named for him in Huron County, Sherman Township. And he came out to see what was going on, what things looked like, because his son was living here. And he contracted some sort of swamp malarial disease, went back to Connecticut and died the next year. So it didn't profit him too much to come to Ohio. Taylor Sherman, by the way, was the grandfather of General William Tecumseh Sherman of Civil War fame, and the grandfather of U.S. Senator John Sherman from Mansfield, who was in Congress for years and years and years and wrote the Sherman Antitrust Act. I don't know if anybody else remembers it, but I remember studying that in high school. I don't think it was current events then, but nevertheless, we studied that. Well, when the surveying was done late in the year of 1808, the Fire Sufferers Committee named there were 31 townships in all the Firelands when it was surveyed out into these 5-mile square tracts. One township was named for each suffering town except East Haven. Every town that I named as having been rated had a township named for it. Some of the others were named for members of the board, strangely enough. They were in control of naming them, so they named them after themselves. And some were named for a major landowner in the township. For instance, Ripley for Mr. Ripley, Fitchville for Mr. Fitch, and Wakeman for Mr. Wakeman. Those were names of some of the men who owned a great deal of land. Now, originally, at that time, in 1808, 1809, the entire Firelands was one county, Huron County, 500,000 acres, pretty big tract of land. But there was almost nobody living in it, so it didn't make any difference how big it was. It didn't necessarily have a state representative in the state legislature because it was attached to Cuyahoga County for judicial purposes. So Cuyahoga County controlled what took place out here until enough settlers got here. Now, when they did name the townships, Norwalk Township happened to be near the center of the fire sufferers tract, near the center of Huron County. As I said, a township, we call them townships. In Connecticut, they often call them towns rather than a township. And eventually, Huron County was divided as more and more settlers came in the next 20 years or so. A lot of the old counties were broken up and more counties were created because people, if I lived clear down in the corner of Huron County, it was more than a day's trip to get to Norwalk to the county seat. So, or if I lived in Sandusky, to come to Norwalk, it takes about 20 minutes, but then it might take all day depending on the condition of the road. So in the years 1838 and 1840, Huron County was broken up and Erie County formed out of the north part. One other reason for breaking up these counties is it put more representatives in the state legislature and more senators in the state legislature, therefore more votes. A party had a better chance maybe of getting something through because they had more of their party in office. The more legislators there were, the more votes there were to work about. Well, in 1808, after the surveying, sporadic settlement of old Huron County began. There had been a few people come and were living along the lakeshore. They were actually squatters, but they weren't squatting to illegally be on somebody's land. They were waiting to be able to buy it, but they couldn't buy it because it had not been allotted out yet to the sufferers. Well, the migration was slow because of the remote location and the concerns that the American Indians living here weren't exactly happy that the settlers were moving in, even though they had received money and gifts under the Treaty of 1805. And the War of 1812 was looming. The British were trying to reclaim this old Northwest territory that we're part of. And when the war did break out in 1812, almost everybody left this area, left Huron County. And there were a few deaths from American Indian raids because the Indians sided with the British. And those were people who didn't leave quickly enough or who thought that they were all right, that they didn't need to worry about leaving. They could take care of things. Well, I'm afraid they didn't, unfortunately. The first term of court was held in 1815 after the war ended, and that was at the old county seat, the original county seat, which was about 7 miles north of Norwalk. Now it's what is in Erie County. And then the courthouse, it wasn't the courthouse open every day as there is now, and trials going on every day and so forth. The court met once, maybe twice a year if a county didn't have a lot of legal business. I think at first Huron County's court just met twice a year. And that's when lawsuits were heard, when cases were filed, when estates were handled and so forth, probate matters and what have you. And it was like the circuit rider thing, like Abraham Lincoln in Illinois. And at that first term of court in 1815, there was an attorney, Elisha Whittlesey, he was living in Canfield, Ohio. He was born in Washington, Connecticut. He was here as an attorney because what the attorneys did was follow the sessions of court, because that's how they got clients. If somebody wanted to file a lawsuit against somebody, here was an attorney to do it. But he didn't have an office. He didn't have gold letters on his office door or anything like that. He was circuit riding with the judge and with the others of the court. Well, with Elisha Whittlesey was an acquaintance, a man named Platt Benedict from Danbury, Connecticut. He had come out to Ohio just to look around after the war and see what was going on. Well, at this first term of court, they heard people complaining about the county seat location, that the Huron River was too wide, too deep to build mill dams on to run water-powered mills, which any community needed. There wasn't good clay for making bricks. There wasn't a lot of sandstone available for building chimneys. And so a lot of people were unhappy with that location. And Elisha Whittlesey and Platt Benedict heard somebody say, well, there's that Sand Ridge over in Norwalk Township. That'd be a good place for a county seat for a town. Well, they rode over here, looked the place over, talked to some other potential investors. And when they came to Norwalk and looked around, they found good stone available, sandstone for building, clay that looked suitable for making bricks. In those days, they didn't ship the bricks in from someplace. They had to make them almost on site because there was such poor transportation. And what we call now Norwalk Creek gave a good supply of water for drinking and running water-powered mills. And of course, just west of Norwalk was the Huron River, which also could be dammed up. If you'd seen the condition of Norwalk Creek in the 20th century, you wouldn't want to come here and drink much of the water, but it's better now. But in those days, of course, no one living here, the water was pretty clean. Well, Platt Benedict returned hastily to Connecticut and secured the purchase of these lands where the city of Norwalk now stands. That is where the downtown blocks or the uptown blocks, whichever you want to call it, whether considered Norwalk to have a downtown or an uptown. The land that's West Main Street is a separate tract that was taken care of in a different manner. But where the city of Norwalk, the original, the old part of the town on the Sand Ridge was secured and a town surveyed out, platted out into lots. The Sand Ridge was high and dry because it is an ancient shore of Lake Erie. It's left over from the time the glaciers melted and the Lake Erie was much, much bigger. It wasn't even called Lake Erie. I'm not going to get into geology because that's not one of my strong points. The ridge, if you notice in Norwalk, pay attention, all the streets to the north of Main Street slope down a little because of the ridge, and you can see it out on both East and West Main. You can see that it's higher ground, and that was a natural Indian trail. That was an early road because it was nice and high and dry. When they began in the late 1800s digging utility line trenches in Main Street, putting in water lines and gas lines and things like that, they found all kinds of petrified wood, Lake Erie fossils, fossils of lake creatures, and flowers and reeds that grow along, then were growing, a lot of them, along the edge of the lake, along the beach. And in some cases, when they dug them out, they just threw them aside, and those things sprouted in the next season. They still, the seeds were still viable in those lake plants. And if we were to dig down now in Main Street, we'd find that there are petrified wood and so forth and fossils. Well, this original plat was laid out in 1816, and the village was named Norwalk by Elisha Whittlesey, who was the owner of the land, because it was in Norwalk Township. And that's an old custom in Connecticut. As folks there know, Norwalk, Connecticut is in the town of Norwalk. And there is an old popular urban legend in Norwalk that Platt Benedict named the town Norwalk when he and his wife brought their family here in 1817. Well, he did it because the neighboring town of Norwalk had been burned by the British. Well, so had his town of Danbury. So why didn't he name it Danbury? But it had nothing to do with the naming of it, Platt Benedict. So that's a legend we can put aside. It was done by Elisha Whittlesey. But then Platt Benedict and his family came out here in 1817. His wife was Sally DeForest, and they brought their 5 children with them. We now have a DAR chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, named after Sally DeForest. She was a daughter of the American Revolution, and several of her descendants were charter members of that chapter. It's one of the oldest in the state. It was started in 1915, so it's been around for a while. And by the way, Norwalk, Ohio is not the only town named for Norwalk, Connecticut. There are 6 or 7 others in the country, the other Norwalks, and almost all of them were named by people who had come from Norwalk, Ohio. They must have kept good memories of it. There's one in Michigan, 2, I believe, in Iowa, Wisconsin, Kansas, and there's one in California. That's a large city, over 100,000 people, but it's not named for Norwalk, Ohio. It takes its name from something before it existed. There was some north walk that people would go hiking through the mountains, and that supposedly is how Norwalk, Connecticut got its name, but I'm not going to get into that. We're not going to worry about that tonight. We've got other things to worry about here. One of Platt Benedict's first jobs when he got to Norwalk, Ohio, was to make it an attractive town for people to come and settle. And he was an agent for Elisha Whittlesey. They found a lobbyist to go to the State House in Columbus to lobby the legislature to have the county seat moved to Norwalk from over north of Milan. That was accomplished, and the first term of court was held here in Norwalk in October of 1818. They had built a courthouse that year, not a very big building, was not a courthouse like we might think of now, and probably only had 4 or 5 rooms in it. And they didn't even have a jail completed yet. They didn't have the jail quite done, but the courthouse was, and they had their first term of court here. And the county seat has been in Norwalk ever since. Benedict's home was right in the center of the present business district. And until he died in 1866 at the age of 91, everything he did was to improve and uplift Norwalk. He brought in blooded cattle so the farmers could have better livestock. He brought improved farm implements for people to see and to copy and to have to help do their farm work. He also, in the earliest days, lured craftsmen here, such as blacksmiths or masons, carpenters, furniture makers, so that people would find Norwalk a pleasant place to settle. And of course, the county seat was here, which made it even better because there were attorneys in town to practice law. There were a number of merchants with their general stores and hotel keepers to serve area residents. I don't know whether Benedict had anything to do with it, but in the early days, every stagecoach line, I shouldn't say everyone, but many stagecoach lines went through Norwalk and stopped here so that passengers could get on and off. And that made more hotel business, more restaurant business, more trade, more people, more activity. And that's what Benedict was looking for, was to build up the town. Now, at this point, I always divide the future of Norwalk into 3 segments. The first segment is education. They did not have graded public schools in Ohio at that time. I don't know if they had them anywhere in the country, but Benedict was one of the men on the committee they built an academy here in Norwalk, which opened in 1826. The village was less than 10 years old, but they did, as I said, they did not have the graded school system. And if a young man wanted to become a doctor or a lawyer or a clergyman, he more than likely needed some education in an academy because it was like a high school. And he could do that, then go on to college or to seminary, whatever, to finish his studies. And sometimes a family who had some means would send their daughter to one of these schools. These were co-ed schools. They weren't co-ed colleges. Oberlin College east of us it was the first I think the first co-educational college in the country. But they were co-ed, but young ladies could study a language. They could learn maybe Latin, French, whatever, art, music, and become accomplished. And that's what made them better candidates for getting married, because they were accomplished. And they could go to these schools too. None of the academy operated until 1833. Then it was followed by the Methodist Church running the Norwalk Seminary until 1846, and at last the Baptist Institute until 1855. By that time, the legislature had established school laws, and these private schools were outmoded. We also had in Norwalk during this time several private schools solely for young ladies before the public school system came on the scene. And these schools in Norwalk, all of these ones I've mentioned, none of them ever was a financial success. They were great educational successes. They turned out tremendous students. Students went on to be, President Rutherford Hayes went to school here in Norwalk. General James McPherson from the Civil War went to school in Norwalk. And governors, men who were governors later of 7 different states in the United States, had their education in Norwalk, plus a number of congressmen, any quantity of Methodist clergymen, teachers, educators, college teachers, all went to the Norwalk schools. But as I said, nobody ever made any money off of them. They unfortunately were not a financial success. But during those education years, almost everyone in the town made a living from the school. They had to buy firewood. They heated with fireplaces. So they had to, there were men who cut and sold firewood to the school. There were a lot of women who cooked and baked for the students. Some students boarded themselves in, they had dorm rooms on the 3rd floor of the academy building and the seminary building. There were women in town who would bake for them, cook occasionally, and also would do their laundry for them, so that these people made money from the school. I don't say they made money, but they made a living. And those who had extra space, and if the student could afford it, they boarded with someone in their home. Rutherford Hayes boarded in a house in Norwalk where there were several other students boarding. So that lady made her living running. There's a difference, you know. We read in the phrase rooming house, or rooming house is where you just had a room, but a boarding house is where you sat at the table and ate, because that's the board. And so they were actually a board and room. They lived in that house, and that's where they took their meals also. Well, after these palmy school years, after 1855, Norwalk became a railroad town. The first railroad was built through in 1853, and that was the last link in rail service between New York and Chicago. And that was a big deal at the time, because you could get on a train in New York in 1853 and ride clear to Chicago, not without getting off and changing, but you could do it. And it helped the westward movement toward the completion eventually in the 1860s of the Transcontinental Railroad in Utah. But Norwalk, that line through here, and that was a very small link, but nevertheless, it was a very important one. Our second railroad came to Norwalk in 1881, and that was the Wheeling and Lake Erie. And at the end of the 19th century, our town became a center of electric interurban lines. And the longest line in the entire world was built in 1893 from Sandusky to Norwalk, 20 miles long. That's when electricity was new, and when streetcars were new, interurban cars. And that was the longest line, and didn't have much electric power. Sometimes passengers had to stop the car at a steep hill, and the passengers had to get off and help push it up the hill in order to keep going. But nevertheless, about 1900, a third line, there were 2 corporate-owned companies came here around 1900. Then there was a third line that went north and south from Mansfield to Sandusky. So Norwalk's Main Street and the square, what we call the square in front of the courthouse, was a busy, busy place. There were lots of streetcars and a lot of traffic and a lot of people changing cars and freight and so forth. Norwalk even had what they called a city car, the Dinky, which ran from one end of Main Street to the other, from the West Corporation limits to the East Corporation limits. And it cost you a dime to ride that entire distance. Or if you rode just from your home on West Main to downtown to the courthouse and got off, that was a nickel. That was a half of the ride. And it was a great way, because the streets were pretty muddy, they were unimproved, and the sidewalks weren't much better sometimes. So having the Dinky was a great idea. There was even one family had lived way out on East Main Street, almost to where the Dinky stopped, and then they moved up much closer to the uptown area. And their dog every morning would wait for the streetcar, get on the streetcar, ride out to the old house where they used to live, and he'd spend his day roaming all around where he'd roamed around for so long. And then in the afternoon, he'd come back and wait at the curb for the streetcar to come back, for the Dinky to come back, Mr. Gossman, the conductor, would put him on the streetcar and take him home again. He knew where he belonged. So, but the railroad era, that era, coming to Norwalk and having the interurban service brought on the manufacturing era. That's my third era for Norwalk. After larger factories developed after the Civil War. And we had things such as a large foundry here that made steam engines and other metal parts. That we had manufacture of pianos and organs, and a lot of wood furniture was made in Norwalk during those decades and shipped out on the railroads. And one reason of making metal parts was both railroads had their main shops here. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern had its shop here in Norwalk, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie had their repair shops. And of course, every so often they needed some item made, and if they couldn't make it or couldn't handle it, they always had these foundries to fall back on. In more recent years, of course, we've had other manufacturers such as Norwalk Furniture, Fannie Farmer Candies, and others that have come and gone through the years. Now, Norwalk is a city of 17,000 persons. We have 2 excellent high schools in town. We have a fine public library. We have cultural, and I know I sound like the Chamber of Commerce. We have cultural and recreational facilities, good police and fire protection, I believe. Norwalk remains the county seat. There have been efforts different times to have the county seat moved closer to the center of the county. You see, when Erie County was formed, it's only about 2 miles from the city of Norwalk to the Erie County line. So Norwalk is up in one end of the county, but they've held on. It's still the county seat. Norwalk was incorporated and a mayor elected first in 1828, became a village, reached a city status in the 1880 census. It had a population of over 5,000 people, and that qualified it to be a city under Ohio law. So it has that designation. Our West Main Street, I mentioned earlier that the West Main Street was a different tract from the original city of Norwalk. It was owned by 3 gentlemen in Connecticut and was called the Star and Canfield tract. And those are 2 old names in Connecticut. If there ever were early American families in Connecticut, it was the Stars and the Canfields. But they were sufferers. They had this tract of land, and they laid it out into 5 and 10 acre lots, narrow to the street, but deep. And a man could could live in a suburban environment, build a house on this tract, and back of it, he could have a large garden. He could have a pasture for his cow. They could keep their own horse. They had some trees they could cut down for firewood. They could really live almost a suburban living. And that's where the attorneys and the merchants and the bankers and people such as that built some very fine homes, many of which are still standing. And in 1974, West Main Street was declared to be a historic district on the National Register of Historic Places. And it's one of our points of pride, I believe. And while I'm cheerleading here for Norwalk, I'll mention some of our famous citizens. One of the earliest who lived here, who name should be known to people, I don't know if it is Dan Emmett. Dan Emmett is the man who wrote Dixie. He also may have written Turkey in the Straw and Old Dan Tucker. I believe Old Dan Tucker he's supposed to have written when he was 15 years old, which if that's true, he was living in Norwalk at the time he did that. His family had originated in Mount Vernon, and for some reason, he was born there, but for some reason they moved to Sandusky in the middle 1820s, and then moved to Norwalk and lived there from about 1827 to about 1833, something like that. His father was a blacksmith, and has many ads in the paper, many mentions of the family. But Dan left Norwalk soon after 1820, was a student for a while at the Norwalk Academy. But I don't know that I think he spent more time with his music, and I think that was in his mind even then. Another man who lived here soon after Dan Emmett did was named Henry Wheeler Shaw, and he became known as Josh Billings. He began writing humorous articles and published several books. He also gave lectures all over the country under the name of Josh Billings, and he was a humorist. One of his things, for instance, he wrote was, if you want a mule to stay in a certain pasture, put it in the lot next to it. And as soon as it can, it'll get over the fence into the one where you wanted him in the first place. He was just things like that he observed. He was a great horseman. He was a great judge of horses, and was considered he was considered to be a town character. He was a young man, but his father had money and sent him out here from Massachusetts because he got tired of him hanging around in their town, so he sent him out here where nobody knew him. So we also had a man born here about that time named William Henry. He was an agrarian educator in Wisconsin, and did a great deal for agriculture, of improving the quality of livestock and crops. And he was an early promoter of silos on farms. He almost was considered to be the person who originated silos. I don't know that he was, but he did a lot for it. George Kennan, who was the Siberian traveler and an author in the late 19th century, was born in Norwalk, learned telegraphy. His father was the town telegrapher. And when George was about 20, Western Union put out word that they were going to send an expedition to Siberia to build a telegraph line across Siberia. Well, George signed up to do that, got over there. The line had already been built by some other company. So he traveled around Russia, came home, and wrote on the life in Russia, the exiles of the political dissidents to Siberia, to the salt mines, as they used to say, and of how the czars were treating the people. And George became very unpopular in Russia for some reason. At one time they had a warrant out for him. I don't think they ever arrested him. He also was, in the midst of all this, the first secretary of the National Geographic Society in Washington when it was founded. And he was considered for years to be an authority on Russia. And then it was actually his, I think, grandnephew also was named George Frost Kennan. And he was about the United States' first ambassador to Russia. And I met him once. He came to Norwalk. He was speaking in Oberlin. He was giving some seminars there. And they came over to Norwalk to look over the ancestral home. And he was one who predicted that if they would let Russia or let the Soviet Union alone, it would destroy itself from within. And everybody thought he was crazy, that would never happen. Well, it happened. And I believe he lived to see it. I think he lived to see that happen, although he was about 101 years old when he passed away, but he had a long career. Another man who lived in Norwalk was Alexander Bancroft Johnson. He was born here. I always had the nickname of Ban Johnson. He went to Cincinnati with his family, became a newspaper man, and got interested in baseball. And he created the American League and originated the World Series. And he was the commissioner of baseball for a number of years until the scandals there about 1920, when things fell apart and everything changed. But he was one of the best known men in the country in his time. Another person who born in Norwalk was named George Washington Trendle. His family moved to Detroit when he was little, and he became an attorney, but he also was interested in radio in its early days. And he started several radio stations, and he wasn't a very nice man to work for. If somebody go to him and want a raise, he'd show them false financial reports of the company, making it look like they were bankrupt. And so they could not, so in that, there was just no way they could give that person a raise. But Mr. Trendle was the originator and had the idea of the program, the Lone Ranger, Green Arrow, and Sergeant Preston of the Royal Mounted Police. And those were great radio programs back in the days when Henry Timman was little and sat and listened to the radio. Norwalk also was the home for a few years of a young man named Jack Dosick, who was probably the first American killed at Pearl Harbor. He was in the Navy and was a fireman. And when the attack came, he ran to the station, got the fire truck, drove it out. It was hit by a shell, and he and everybody in it lost their lives. Captain James D. Wolfe is buried in our Woodlawn Cemetery. He was killed with General Custer in 1876 at the Little Bighorn. His wife was a Norwalk girl. He had married her in the West. She was at a fort in the West where he was stationed. She was teaching the children, teaching the school at that fort. And when she was allowed to recover his remains, she had them brought to Norwalk and buried in our Woodlawn Cemetery. Our Woodlawn Cemetery was started in 1854. I give walking tours of the cemetery in the summertime. And of course, one of the places we visit is the grave of Captain De Wolfe. The Fisher brothers originated in Norwalk. If you don't know who they were, you've probably seen their little emblem, Body by Fisher. You open a car door and there'd be that little plate down there. Their father was a carriage maker in Norwalk, wagon maker, carriage maker. They learned the trade. In 1908, they went to Detroit and started the Fisher Body Company, making auto bodies. And one of their radical inventions was making a solid topped automobile. Before that time, cars had been open with either convertible or like a touring car that the top went down. And they decided that people would like to ride in a car that was more than about 20 degrees in the wintertime. And they eventually, about 20 years after they started that company, they sold out to General Motors. General Motors bought the Fisher Body Company, and Fisher stayed affiliated for a long time with General Motors. I have to tell a story about the Fisher brothers. They are in the Automotive Hall of Fame, which is located very near to Greenfield Village, to the Ford Museum at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. If you ever happen to go there, there are a number of people in that Hall of Fame. And when they were going to induct them, they were getting ready to, they couldn't find, there's a glass partition in every place of honor for each candidate, for each person in the Hall of Fame. And it has their signature, not a duplication, I can't think of the word I want, of their signature there. And they couldn't find it. General Motors didn't have anything in their archives. None of the Fisher family was available in Detroit to help them out. And so they eventually contacted me, oddly enough. And I went to probate court, went down in the basement and fished their father's estate file out of the archives. And in there was a document that each one of them had signed, all 7 of them had signed on one document, waiving their rights to administer their father's estate. He had died in Norwalk, Ohio, and they were in Detroit, but they all had to sign a waiver of consent. And there was their signature. So all I had to do was Xerox and send it off to them. So I feel I had a little part in that Automotive Hall of Fame. As I mentioned about Norwalk being the Maple City, Platt Benedict was elected mayor about 1835. He served 2 or 3 different terms. And one of the things he did in that 1835 era was to recruit a number of volunteers and go into the woods to transplant maple trees along Main Street, all the way from the west end of town to not clear to the east end of town, but through the business district and along through the residential area. They grew good without wires. They had no wires to conflict with, no telephone, no electric at that time. And they gave them about 10 years and they looked pretty good. And that gave Norwalk that nickname of Maple City. And now there aren't so many maple trees anymore, but it's still the Maple City. Norwalk was mostly of New York, New England origin. Most of the settlers came from either New York State or many, of course, from Connecticut, some from Massachusetts and so on, Vermont and what have you, until about 1850, when Germans began immigrating to Norwalk, and we acquired a large settlement, not only of German Catholics, but German Lutherans. And they were very active in the community and still are. Their descendants are still there. And when the first railroad was being built there, about 1851, 52, many Irish came to Norwalk, and we acquired a large colony of Irish. And later on, the next generation many of them became engineers and brakemen and flagmen and firemen on the railroads in the steam engine days. And so we had many Irish families who lived in Norwalk. And when the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad was built in 1881, a number of Italians came to Norwalk. They brought them, they went over and recruited them in Italy, brought them here to work on the railroad. And some of them stayed, but in decades after 1900, in 1910 era, 1900, 1910, many others came and they worked on the railroad also, many of them on the section, what they called the section hands, which was the right-of-way maintenance. So that Norwalk became, like every community, a melting pot of various families and various ethnic origins, and a good time was had by all. And of course, they weren't the only ones who ever came here. Well, that's what I have to say about Norwalk, except I want to mention that there are perhaps 5 or 6 other Norwalks in the country. There is a Norwalk in Michigan, 2, I believe, in Iowa. I think one might be a post office, one might be an unincorporated village in Wisconsin and in Kansas. They all were settled or originated by people who came from Norwalk, Ohio. So they must have had good memories of it. And I have good memories of it myself. But the one, as I said, in California is the largest, and it is not named for Norwalk, Ohio, or Norwalk, Connecticut. So if you're traveling around the country, or if you want to Google the name for that matter, you can find all kinds of other Norwalks. Thank you.
This was wonderful. Henry, I have an answer for you about Norwalk, California, from our archivist here in Norwalk, Connecticut. And her name is Lynn Hildebrand. Hi, Lynn. And she says they've been doing some research, and it was actually started by people from Norwalk, Connecticut. That's in the 19th century. So that's an official. So there you go. That's why you couldn't find it through Ohio. All right. So if you have any questions for Henry, please put them in the chat. This has been a wonderful, wonderful introduction to Norwalk, Ohio. I think we learned a lot. Don't assume that we knew everybody's name. No, we did not. So you filled in some blanks that we had. And everybody's enjoying it and getting really good reviews here, Henry. So if you had any questions for Henry, anything that you wanted to know about Norwalk, Ohio and its residents. We didn't know about the railroad, and it was a railroad town. We're just thrilled that Norwalk, Ohio is a thriving community, and it moved west. Here's a question. Do you know anything about the Prairie House on West Main Street?
The Prairie House on West Main was built by Mr. Prechtel, who was a lumber dealer. He had gone to California to a convention. He saw one there. It is not a Frank Lloyd Wright house, but it's a prairie style. And he was so taken with it that he brought plans back with him, and they built that simply as their home because they liked the design so well. They liked the look of the blueprints. And it is a very interesting house inside.
All right, here we got another question. Was the Western Reserve a good choice for Connecticut?
Well, I suppose they they got the sufferers off their neck by giving them the land here, by having the land available to give. And they also, their educational system, I mean, let's say in 1850, that $1 million was generating what then was a lot of money. I don't know how it was invested. I know nothing of the details of that, but I think that benefited Connecticut schools that way.
Mhm. All right. Here's another one. Let's see. Let me just move this up. Hold on. Besides town names and family names, are there any other features of that part of Ohio that are similar to New England?
I don't think so. I mean, well, the land, there's flat land in New England, but there's also a lot of mountains, for instance, in Vermont. But I don't know that the land is similar. I think it is similar. I think the people coming out here didn't find it to be foreign to them. I think it was simply a lot of trees to cut down, and that's what they had. That's how New England was when the first settlers came there.
Absolutely. Even when they left, there was a lot of trees still being cut down.
There's actually, there was a message that was sent to from KC. KC asks, why didn't East Haven have an Ohio township named after it?
Well, I think East Haven is a small town. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But they kind of combined it with New Haven. They kind of, when they listed the sufferers, they kind of listed New Haven, East Haven together. So I presumed East Haven wasn't a bigger community. But I don't know that.
Henry, thank you very much for a very informative talk, and we'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you.